All right, hi and welcome back. I am making a video today here focusing on creating stands for some of your semi-modular instruments, your effects units, your other signal processing devices that maybe share a few things in common. One of these things is you might want to be able to take some of your gear and orient it in such a way that you can more easily access it in terms of your musical setup. So this came about actually, I was working on, I've been working the last little bit of time, I guess a couple months, transitioning from some semi-modular gear to a fully modular system, and it reminds me that I do need to do a video in the future on that. I'll be doing a multi-part video talking about the movement from traditional keyboard instruments, semi-modular instruments, and then into the world of full modular Euro-rack synthesis. So as part of this, I ended up selling quite a bit of gear on reverb.com. Wonderful site. I don't mind giving them a plug because I've bought really good gear on Reverb, used gear, and I've also sold gear and dealt with many good sellers and buyers in the process. So I'm really happy to actually give them a plug. And I do recommend it for a lot of the equipment maybe that you might buy to set up your own studio. In fact, you could, what I'm talking about today in creating some of these stands, you could actually buy some of these on reverb.com, and I got some of these ideas actually going on there. So you'll notice on either Reverb or Etsy or some of those sites that they sell, usually they're plastic, and presumably they print these out on 3D printers, and they allow you essentially to prop up your gear. There's a slew of ready-made devices you can buy, stands basically that range from, say, some of the Roland Boutique series to, say, the DFAM, some of the other instruments. So what I was interested in doing is, as I'm moving from like a horizontal layout, if you think of maybe playing a keyboard, it's laid out horizontally, you interact with it this way. You can certainly do that with Euro-rack as far as having your case and interacting with it this way, but the way I like to use it is more in a vertical sense, and I'll show you later in some future videos on how sort of my studio has moved horizontally to a more vertical orientation. So what I wanted to do, and I'll show you some of the gear that I'm working with. So I wanted to take, for example, the Streshfet, and I ended up keeping some gear that kind of fit a number of different parameters for me. In this case, the size and the uniqueness. This is a Waldorf string synthesizer. I think it's really fun to play with and to tweak. It's very simple. It has a MIDI in and out. It has USB power and stereo out. So essentially, I wanted to be able to play this not horizontally but vertically. Now you're probably saying, well, you could just set it on the table, and indeed you could. It is the type of instrument that could be used this way, but I essentially wanted something that allowed me to play with it, maybe not at a full vertical position. So what I ended up doing was creating this stand here. Okay, so I ended up creating this particular stand, and anything I've done here is really simple in terms of using, cutting the wood and gluing it and so forth. Essentially everything I'm doing is with my really simple table saw here, this Blade Runner, and using my favorite Tight Bond 3 wood glue to glue everything. I've used this for making my own instruments. If you've seen some of my other videos, I've created instruments, and it's for me the best glue out there. So this particular stand is really simple. So essentially it has two positions. You could stand it up this way, or as you can see, it tilts. You can use it this way. So if I put in the Streshfet, you can see it fits in there. Originally I was going to make this a little snugger, but I got nervous that it wasn't going to fit. And when I'm creating something like this, I'm not really too concerned about how it looks, like aesthetically. It's fun to create this stuff, but I feel like you're really good with crafting wood devices. You could certainly go crazy on a lot of this. But as I said, in this particular concept, you could do it upright, but I really don't envision it working that way. But what I want to do is essentially work with it in this position. And when I first created this, actually, I didn't have this bottom piece of wood, and it was slipping out. So what I'm usually doing is I come up with a concept, and then based on that concept, I adapt it over time. And let me give you just a suggestion, because if you are good at creating patterns and stuff, this may not be necessary. What I like to do is when I get an idea, and in some cases I will actually find an idea online of, say, the shape of a particular side or something like that, and then adapt it. So I saw something online for a similar box, and then I adapted it a little bit, added this back piece, and then eventually this bottom piece. What I like to do, though, is to take cardboard at the initial stage, because then I can see if it's going to work, and you can actually use the cardboard to fit it around your instrument. So in this particular case, I cut out what I thought the pattern would be using just a ruler and a few points, and cut it out with scissors. Very easy to do with some light gauge cardboard. And then I fit the Waldorf inside of it to see if it would fit, and indeed it did. And so, you know, based on that, you can begin with something like this. And then what I simply did was I took wood, I traced this pattern on it, the 4 points. You know, with your saw, it's really easy, right? Just with your adjustments to get something pretty straight. And essentially I just had to cut 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces of wood based on my pattern. Again, this was a later edition. And then I glued it and then eventually stained it. It's just about dry here. I think it's completely dry. And yeah, so the concept will be to use it with the Waldorf, stick it in like this. I'll show you in one of my videos later, but let me just give you a sense of this. So what I'm doing essentially is in my office/studio, I've set up some shelves. And so what I did was I just measured the width of the shelf boards to make sure that these devices, these stands rather, that I'm creating will fit on the shelves. And so the idea is that I will be able to plug this in. I'm actually using a Hermit for all my sequencing now on my Eurorack system, and it allows me, of course, to use the MIDI in, and then I can take my outs to my mixer so I can run my cables through the back. And then the reason I wanted it in this particular position, maybe not fully upright, if it's in fully upright position, just how I'm standing, I'm not going to be able to really see or access some of the bottom knobs here as far as tweaking sounds. In this particular layout angle, it's just really easy to use. Okay, so that's the first one I created. I'm pretty happy with it, and this is pretty specific to the Stretchfett. There's other Waldorfs, the Rocket as well, that have this similar nice square design that is, I think, pretty easy to create for in terms of making a stand. So let me show you. There's essentially 2 types of stands I created. So this next one is going to be useful for me with 2 of my gear setups here, including the Behringer Model D, which I just absolutely love. And it's one of these synthesizers that is really all about tweaking and changing parameters and flipping switches and dialing things in, and of course patching things out with the semi-modular capabilities. So that is the first device I was interested in creating a stand for. And the second one is, you've seen some of my videos on this, the Coma Field Kit, the original Field Kit. This is another one, you know, you might look at it and say, well, actually you can stand it up upright. But as you're going to see my setup later, if I have this on a shelf essentially in my studio, I can't really see what I'm doing here, right? I mean, that angle is not particularly good. It's usable, and you can do this. Now again, you know, for your setup, you may have it flat like this, but as I show you some of what I'm working with later in some of my videos, you're going to see why I did this. So I wanted to essentially create a stand that would work for both of these. And actually I began with the Model D, and I discovered that the exact same stand with one minor modification would also work for the Field Kit. I did the same thing as I mentioned in the previous stand. Was I used cardboard, and I just essentially thought about it kind of logically. What was I looking for? I wanted something to prop up both of these devices and so it wouldn't slip, hold it essentially at the bottom. So again, I used my cardboard, I cut things out, and I was able to put both the Behringer and the coma in here to check it out to make sure that it worked. What I'm going to tell you in this one I think is kind of useful. I'm using this poplar wood. You can get this in the States at Home Depot or Lowe's, your favorite big box store. If you're in Europe or something like that, you have your own versions of that. It's pre-cut. It's a nice width for what I'm going to be doing. So this is about 4 centimeters here, or 1.5 inches. So it's a really good width, I discovered. I think this particular piece is like 4 feet long or so, and it's like $2.50, again, American US dollars. So really cheap to buy. So essentially what I did was, after I made my pattern, was I cut out all of the various parts and just labeled them. So using my pattern here, I labeled the bottom, the top, and so you can see here, and this is actually for my second one. I just have one finished one. I've got to create the second one. And then I labeled the rear piece and the front piece. And then as I'm working with this, essentially, even though I have a pattern, I'm always kind of looking like, okay, you know, how can I make this work? If this is my front piece and this is my rear piece, I'm going to need something in the middle. And this is where a lot of the fine tuning happens. What I found on this particular stand as opposed to the last stand is I had to do more fine tuning towards the end to get some of these pieces correct. When you're making 2 of these, and you're going to see they're independent of one another, unlike the last stand I created, that's one full piece. This is going to be independent, and so obviously when these two of these are side by side, you know, the height here relative to the instrument or here might actually matter. So I ended up resawing some things as I was creating the first set today, and also sanding using my power sander to get it very uniform. And essentially it's 2 pieces. And again, I got this idea online. I actually saw something similar to this, like a 3D printer type thing, and it didn't have this particular piece, and I actually ended up adding this to give me more rise, to give me more lift. So essentially what will happen here is it'll sit like that, and in this case the field kit will just go right like that. And as you can see, you know, this is not super fancy, but one of the nice things about having just a simple saw, you know, some pre-cut wood, some nice wood glue, and maybe some stain or some spray paint, whatever you want, is you can do really whatever you would like. So in this particular case, if I wanted it to look really nice, right, I could get this more flush here and cut it. But all essentially I want to do is to be able to put this on a shelf, and this is a pretty good angle for me to work with. In the case of the field kit, there is potentially a lot of tweaking or movement, dialing things in on the fly, so I think therefore it's useful to have it in this particular position. I can adjust, you know, my sensor block, I can adjust the LFO, I can dial in the CV radio, I can, you know, attenuate and do some gain stuff here. So essentially my concept is I'll have you know, either piezo mics, or I could have some other audio coming in from my modular gear, particularly with my mutable instruments ear modules. I have 2 of those, or some of my solenoid Eurorack modules. And then it's very easy for me to access. Again, the power cord goes back here. Nothing's obstructed. I don't have to worry about anything on the bottom, really, or on the sides. Yeah, so that's kind of like how the final product will look here using the original field kit. And you know, the wood, it's not the exact match with the stain, but you know, since this already has that wood look to it, the aesthetic, you know, the stand looks pretty good here. Again, you could paint it whatever color that you want to paint it. It's entirely up to you. So the second use of this is for the Model D, and what I discovered was really these 2 stands, or this one stand rather, will work both for the Model D and the field kit. Now what I am going to do here, so as you can see here what's going on, and this is another one, like I think you might be thinking, well, you could actually stand your Model D up. It really wouldn't work. It's not super I mean, it'll stay like this, but once I start doing anything like that, it's going to wobble around. And just think about this. If this is on a shelf, I can't read, unless I had these memorized, I can't read the knobs, and I can't really access them. It doesn't really work. So you have to get that angle upwards so you can access the instrument. Now in the back, you'll have, in some cases, if you're making your own stands, you'll have little what do you call them? Table protectors. I can't think of them, but you might have to look out for those just if you're dealing with the back, the rear of the instrument. I'm going to tell you something. You're probably noticing something immediate, and I'll tell you about that in a second and how I'm going to redesign that. But essentially, that back, the piece in the back that I added. So this was my original concept. I added that new piece, probably about this size, because what I realized when I had it just like this, and again I tested with the cardboard, well, we can actually see it. It's not really a good enough angle. To me, it's better than just flat on the table, but there's already a pretty nice angle here. So when you have a Model D, there's already a bit of a angle upwards for you. But this wasn't quite enough, and so as I was testing and thinking about it, I just added that additional piece. And the same thing with some wood glue. It's really solid. The one thing I will say is when you're doing your joints, sometimes this will not be totally flush with the wood. You'll get a little gap. What I do is I just take my wood glue and a toothpick, and I just keep adding another coat, maybe if I flip it over after one side has dried. I found also that in a couple cases I had to get really creative. I do have a series of clamps, but some of my clamps didn't work either on this case, this stand, or the last stand I showed you. I didn't have a clamp long enough to hold this together, so I had to glue it using some books, and I clamped this board down and did one side at a time. So it was a little trickier just because I didn't have clamps that would have enough width to them. Likewise, in this case, I actually ended up, when I added this last piece here, it worked really well. I just used the weight of the Model D to hold it in place really flush on the back, and then once it dried, it was perfect. So I actually used the instrument itself to hold that in place while it was drying. Now, so the one thing you're noticing, it worked okay for the feel kit. In this particular case, it's pretty, it's pretty sloppy, right? So I think what I'm going to do is, on my next version, I have the pieces cut out, but I'll just take my, wherever my front is here, I'll take my front board, and I'm thinking I should get that lower. What do you think? Like maybe another centimeter or two. The key is, what I want to happen is, because it's pushing backwards with the piece on the back, I just have to make sure that it's not too low, obviously, if it would end up falling forward. Because what actually happens here is the instrument's touching here, and then this is holding it. So I just have to experiment a little bit, but this will work for the feel kit, so this will be my stand for the feel kit. For the Model D, this isn't quite good because we're getting a little tight down here working with the knobs. Again, I can adjust it and put it more like that, but in this case, you're seeing it's actually almost going to hit the knob itself. So I have to work on that a little bit and perfect it, and but this is getting just about where I wanted it, right? It's not fully upright, but with this on a shelf, what I can essentially do is very easily access everything. I can still use my MIDI if I want, and I can take advantage of the semi-modularity of it and run any of my Eurorack modules in and out here into the Model D. Yeah, so in any case, it's just wanted to offer the video today to just give you some ideas about what you can do relative to creating your own stands for some of your instruments. They don't have to be particularly fancy. They're super cheap to make, actually. You could make any of these for a couple bucks. Another option is you go onto Etsy, you go onto Reverb, and you buy them pre-made, which is fine. They tend to run a little more than making it yourself. They're maybe sometimes like $20 or even upwards of $50, depending on what you're buying. So that's it for today. Continued good luck with your own experiments. in the sonic world of modular synthesis, semi-modular synthesis, or whatever it is that you happen to be working with. And please come back and check out some additional videos in the future where I will show you more about creating stuff, making stuff for the many sonic worlds that I have explored and will continue to explore in the future.